If you're interested in learning more about AVP and the workshops, I'd encourage you to talk to Nancy or Dave or Lulu Comstock or Mary Fletcher, some of the members of the congregation that have been involved. Each year at the Unitarian Universalist General Assembly, one of the highlights is the Ware Lecture. I will not indulge right now in telling you who Ware is, that it was named after, but it's three generations of very influential Unitarians had the last name Ware. But the Ware Lecture has been given annually since 1922. Past Ware lecturers include Reinhold Niebuhr, Howard Thurman, Saul Alinsky, Kurt Vonnegut, Elaine Pagels, Mary Oliver, Karen Armstrong, and many other luminaries. If you're interested, you can read most of the online archived transcripts of the Ware Lectures on the UUA website. In 1966, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered the Ware Lecture, and it was titled, "Don't Sleep Through the Revolution." It included these words to the gathered Unitarian Universalists that year in Hollywood, Florida. "There are some things in our nation and in our world to which I'm proud to be maladjusted. And I call upon you to be maladjusted and all people of goodwill to be maladjusted to these things until the good society is realized. I never intend to adjust myself to segregation or discrimination. I never intend to adjust myself to economic conditions that take necessities from the many to give luxuries to the few and leave millions of people perishing on lonely islands of poverty amidst a vast ocean of prosperity. Yes, I must confess that I firmly believe that our world is in dire need of a new organization, the International Association for the Advancement of Creative Maladjustment. Today, almost 5 decades later, we are right to be maladjusted to a criminal justice system that has failed to provide justice for Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Eric Gardner, and so many others, people of color. Relatedly, a colleague recently reminded me that as familiar as we are with the soaring rhetoric that comes at the end of another speech by Martin Luther King Jr., the I Have a Dream speech, most of us are much less familiar with the rest of the speech that he gave that day, which includes this line: "We can never be satisfied as long as the Negro is the victim of the unspeakable horrors of police brutality." As I said last Sunday, for more context about the ways that there are strong parallels between today and the very conditions that led to the formation of the Civil Rights Movement, I strongly recommend Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow: Mass Incarceration in an Age of Colorblindness. As some of you will recall, the foreword to that important book was written by Dr. Cornel West, a contemporary prophetic voice for racial justice. In light of recent protests in Ferguson, in Cleveland, in New York City, and across our country, I was pleased to see that the 2015 Ware Lecturer in Portland, Oregon this year will be Dr. Cornel West. One of my favorite quotes from West is that justice is what love looks like in public. Justice is what love looks like in public. Dr. West will no doubt invite us to reflect on what it means to be creatively maladjusted to injustice in the 21st century. We should never intend to adjust ourselves to conflicts between police and citizens that so quickly and unnecessarily escalate to the use of deadly force from which there is no turning back, especially when there's a long-term pattern of racial bias in when that deadly force is used. Our second UU principle calls for justice, equity, and compassion in human relations. And our second source is the words and deeds of prophetic men and women, which challenge us to confront the power and structures of evil with justice, with compassion, and with the transforming power of love. And justice is what love looks like in public. Now, I shared with you one framework for creative maladjustment a few weeks ago in a sermon on the transformative power of recognizing the inherent worth and dignity of every person, which includes starting with recognizing the inherent worth and dignity of ourselves. And in that sermon, I shared the result of a study of 2,500 people imprisoned for murder. When asked why they felt compelled to kill, the majority of the inmates responded, "Because I felt disrespected." You heard a little bit about that this morning in the spoken meditation. In the spoken meditation, you heard some about a second framework for creative maladjustment to violence. Powerful testimonies from both facilitators and inmates who became facilitators in the ongoing Alternatives for Violence project, which seeks to equip prison inmates, school children, and community members with tools to diffuse conflict without resorting to violence. We heard yet another framework for creative maladjustment, and we sang a little bit about it in our opening hymn in the Dharma talk last Sunday from the visiting Buddhist monk Bhante Sujata, who shared with us the practice of metta, M-E-T-T-A, or loving kindness meditation, in which you mindfully envision, and this is particularly helpful if you know you're going to be entering into a situation of conflict, or you just had a conflictual experience, or you're feeling a little road rage coming on, as Bhante talked about, or you find yourself in the middle of a conflictual situation, to just pause and think to yourself, may I be filled with loving kindness. May I be well. May I be peaceful and at ease. And then the second step is to wish that in the second person. May you be well. May you be filled with loving kindness. May you be peaceful and at ease. And then to wish that for all beings. May we be at peace. May we be well. May we be peaceful and at ease. When you contemplatively expand that from I to you to we and practice that as part throughout your day, you can really find yourself much more centered. You can shift your perspective on your experiences and reconnect compassionately with yourself, with others around you, and with this world. And while there are vital systemic changes that we need to make to reform our criminal justice system, this morning I'd like to share with you one more framework for being creatively maladjusted to violence in your own life, a change that we can begin to make immediately. The insight I would like to share are from the Center for Nonviolent Communication, founded by the psychologist Dr. Michael Rosenberg. And my hope is really just to increase our awareness of when we find ourselves in conflict, or even when we find ourselves responding to a situation of escalating violence. And that can be physical, but that can also be verbal, when we find our tone of voice raising and sharpening, that we can increasingly realize that there are healthier, more compassionate ways of engaging. And I think it can start by, 10 minutes after or the day after you say, I need to re-engage from a more compassionate place. And then it can move to right afterwards. And then it can move to, in the middle of yelling at somebody, you can say, stop, hold on, and try to reconnect and re-engage compassionately. The 3 steps in Dr. Rosenberg's method of nonviolent communication are to observe what is happening in the situation without any judgment or evaluation, to state how we feel as we observe this action, and then to say what needs of ours are underneath those feelings. As you can perhaps guess, this practice can seem pretty easy in theory, but then when you actually do it, especially if you try to have a nonviolent communication practice and you record it, so you actually see what you said and go back and analyze that, you see this is actually much more difficult than it seems, and especially observing without judgment, is very difficult. Especially if the situation is a conflict in which we're deeply enmeshed, and not all of us are in touch with our feelings, much less experienced in identifying the deep underlying need that's actually underneath those feelings. Rosenberg's books, such as Nonviolent Communication and Living Nonviolent Communication, have many specific examples. This morning I'll just give you 3. See if you can hear the difference between an example of an observation with just observation alone, bare observation without evaluation or judgment, and one with evaluation and judgment mixed in. So what's the difference between you are too generous and when notice that I word, right? When I see you giving all your lunch money to others, I think you are being too generous, right? I see this and this is what I think, versus you're too generous, right? They're very different things. What about the difference between he procrastinates, definitive, evaluative judgment, right? And an observation that, I've only seen him study the night before the test. And what's the difference between, you never do what I want? What's the difference between that and the last 3 times I wanted to do something, you didn't want to do it? That's a specific observation without judgment. So if we find ourselves in conflict, the first step is evaluating without judgment. It's about slowing down. It's about taking responsibility for specifically naming just what we objectively observe, trying as much as possible to bracket out subjective evaluations, and restraining ourselves from imputing judgments and motives on people that may not actually be the case, or may be only part of the case. After Freud, we know that we are unconscious of many aspects of our own motivations, so most assuredly, we do not know the full extent of what's going on inside another person. Moreover, Freud and other psychologists caution us to be aware of the ways that we unconsciously project our feelings and our repressions on to other people. So if you notice yourself having a particularly exaggerated reaction, so you've gone from like 0 to 60 with someone, that's a big red flag that it may actually be something inside yourself that's being triggered, some part of your shadow side. And one of Rosenberg's best tips for taking responsibility for your subjective perceptions is not only the classic advice of using I statements, but also to make sure that the pronoun I always follows the word because. Make sure the word I, that you don't only start with that sentence, but you use it to follow the word because. I'll give you an example. I feel angry because you did this. That's the wrong way. Versus, I feel angry because I. And when you say that I feel angry because I, it's inviting you to remember to get in touch with it. What is it about you? What need is not being met for you, not just what you think about that other person? So again, the practice of nonviolent communication invites you to slow down, to observe without judgment, and acknowledge the limitations of our finite first-person perspective. Step 2 is to name the emotional elephant in the room. And if being in your touch with your emotions is not your strong suit, you can go a long way with the basic 4 emotions. Look inside yourself and see, are you feeling mad, sad, glad, or bad? And bad really means scared, but scared doesn't rhyme with the other 3. So we say mad, sad, glad, or bad. Now there's of course a whole host of other emotions. I'll get you a chart if you'd like one. But you can get a long way just by starting with those 4. And I first learned a version of this practice more than a decade ago, and I've seen it and practiced it myself many times since. And I've repeatedly sensed, and maybe you can think of some times in your own experience when this has been the case, that I've sensed a palpable shift in what was going on in the room. A shift to a deeper register when communication shifts from shouting these interpretive judgments back and forth to someone naming the emotional elephant in the room. I feel really sad right now. I feel really scared right now. It can really change. When one person stops armoring themselves up with rationalizations and allows themselves to be vulnerable enough to name, I feel really scared. There's an opening in which transformation suddenly has a chance to take place. And that's the power of the second step of nonviolent communication, to get us talking at a deeper level about what's really going on, the 90% of the iceberg that's beneath the surface. At this point, I should mention that my favorite part of Rosenberg's middle step is his description of the ironically violent evolution, and maybe some of you have seen this happen as well, that many of us go through in becoming more emotionally literate. The most important part, of course, is that initial insight that you heard many of those ADP inmates begin to have, that you don't have to be responsible for other people's feelings, becoming differentiated. Someone's bucking up on you and realize that that's your stuff, not my stuff. That's an incredibly powerful insight. And Rosenberg calls that insight liberation from emotional slavery, just being enslaved to everything everyone else does. Unfortunately, the zeal of the convert, and you may have seen this, that many of us pass through, is an initial obnoxious stage in which you hear the not quite fully nonviolent exchanges such as, that's your problem, I'm not responsible for your feelings. Have you know that people are trying to self-differentiate, and they do it in an unfortunately violent and strident way. Over time, we can reach a more healthy differentiation from others and express our emotional liberation more compassionately. It takes time and practice. But I mentioned earlier that there's often a profound shift that happens when a conflict moves from interpretation to feeling. But to have the greatest chance of lasting change, you need the third and final step of naming and identifying the need that's really connected to those feelings that are busting through. A classic example of why this final step is important is the spouse who asked her partner to spend less time at work. 3 weeks later, he responded by announcing that he'd signed up for a golf tournament. She should have said, "I'd like you to spend at least one night in the evening at home instead of at work." Failing to articulate the underlying need often results in passive aggression and miscommunication that doesn't get us anywhere. All this being said, if you begin experimenting with some of these techniques of nonviolent communication, you'll find that it's most difficult, unfortunately, to practice with those we love the most, those we care about the most, those we're around the most. As you've heard me say before, in a proverb that's particularly resonant during the holiday season, our families can most easily push our buttons because they're the ones that sewed our buttons on in the first place. So as you begin to try to unravel and sew those buttons on a little looser, naming our feelings and naming the underlying needs are important steps in working toward being increasingly filled with loving kindness for yourself and for others, being well, being peaceful and at ease in more and more times and places. And if you suddenly wake up, even after thinking through all this and practicing it for a while, in the middle of falling into a habitual pattern of violence, especially with someone you love that's falling short of the ideals of nonviolent communication, I invite you to stop and say to yourself, wait. And as some of you remember, WAIT is an acronym that stands for, anybody remember? What is it? Why am I talking? WAIT means, why am I talking? So that's really helpful to say to yourself sometimes. Just wait and stop and ask yourself, why am I talking? Take a few breaths. Move away from the source of conflict if you need to. But then challenge yourself when you're ready, when you feel safe enough to be vulnerable enough to re-engage in a more compassionate way. Name your feelings, name your underlying need, and really discern what's underneath the conflict. And even as we continue to work with partner organizations such as the UU Legislative Ministry of Maryland and the larger UU Association and our other partner organizations to make systemic changes in our society, changes to things we are rightly maladjusted to, there are changes we can make immediately in ourselves and in our everyday reactions to be more nonviolent. And in so doing, may we do our part in hastening the day, in the words of the old spiritual, when we may lay down our burden, when we may lay down our sword and shield, when we may study war no more. May it be so.